During the summer of 2018, I watched a lot of movies. Like, even more than I normally watch. And that was because of one simple reason. MoviePass. The now defunct app that vastly underestimated how much people would like to go to movies for a fraction of a regular ticket cost, allowed me to justify seeing any movie that was available. Especially if you were recommended the app, then you got 1 month free, so you really didn't have an excuse for not trying it out. And while MoviePass's demise was a surprise to no one, and its slow limp towards the grave has been a painful one, I'm really happy I got to take advantage for a few short months before I deleted the app. Because, amidst a frenzy of superhero behemoths and box office blockbusters, a film came out about an unassuming looking man with a heart full of love, a head full of ideas, and a zip-up sweater. That film was Won't You Be My Neighbor? This 2-hour look at Fred Rogers and his approach to children's television was by far and away the most emotional I was in a theater that year, and for good reason. Won't You Be My Neighbor's honest look at the man behind one of television's most successful and revered children's programs was real and frank, just as was Mr. Rogers' handlement of complex subject matters that he aimed at children. This documentary saw unprecedented success, especially for its niche genre. It became the highest-grossing biographical documentary of all time, raking in $22 million, and became the 12th largest-grossing documentary of all time. And while this seems like a relatively low number in relation to the average amount of money most movies, even terrible ones, make, it is actually pretty high when compared to the relatively small budget that most documentaries have. This is also even more impressive once you learn that most of the top grossing documentaries ahead of Won't You Be My Neighbor are pop star behind the scenes tour documentaries. Now, I love this movie, probably more than most, but it's hard to watch a film such as this and wonder if you were liking the film because it itself is great or because the thing the movie is about is great. And to try and answer this question, I wanted to come up with a few criteria for what makes a documentary great, and to see if Won't You Be My Neighbor checks those boxes. With a documentary, you know that what you are seeing to be true, and for a lot of people, they already know in their minds whether or not they like the subject of the documentary. Now, that's not to say the purpose of the film can't be to change your opinion on someone or something that you thought you already knew about. This is a common part of a lot of documentaries, especially sports documentaries. They focus on a player or a team that the filmmakers know a lot of people will probably have strong feelings about whether for or against. Because, by the nature of sports, if a player plays for your favorite team, you probably love them, and if you play against them, then you probably hate them. ESPN's 30 for 30 are a premier example of looking into controversial figures and teams in sports. Examples of this such as I Hate Christian Laettner or the Detroit Bad Boys. These are controversial figures in sports, and the documentarian hopes to paint them in a different light than most people perceive them. However, I don't think that's the point that Won't You Be My Neighbor is trying to make. For almost all the people that knew him or knew of him, I can assume that their impression of him was that of a positive one. A warm-hearted, sweater-wearing, lovable man who taught you life lessons and made you think about tough questions, usually through the medium of puppets or song. Some people grew up watching this man, others watched their own children become enamored with the kindly Mr. Rogers, whether watching the episodes as they aired or as reruns. My point is that most of the population went into this movie already having a positive opinion of Mr. Rogers, myself included, and this film did not set out to change that. What I do think that Won't You Be My Neighbor set out to do is two things that all great documentaries do. Appeal to the audience, regardless of how familiar they are with the subject matter, and tell a compelling story about a true person or event. I firmly believe that this film accomplished both of these feats. It achieved the first by showing many different moments in which Mr. Rogers made a difference, whether on a large scale or a small one. The filmmaker shows different clips from Mr. Rogers' career that perhaps the audience wasn't aware of that he had accomplished. Whether that was him trying to fight racism by sharing a dip in the pool with Officer Clemens, or by giving a speech to Congress that went a long way to securing the necessary funding to keep PBS on the air. For some watching the film, they may already know that Mr. Rogers did these things and were already impressed by them. And for those viewers, the only new information this documentary can offer to them is the interviews and footage that hasn't been aired before, and other people's takes on those events that they knew Mr. Rogers already had accomplished, whether this be from Mr. Rogers himself or those that were close to him at the time. However, for the viewers who are less knowledgeable on the subject, this is all new information for them. I like to think about this aspect of documentaries in terms of a favorite subgenre of mine, rock docs. Documentaries on bands are nothing new, and there are plenty of fantastic examples, such as the Beatles' It's a Hard Day's Night to Iron Maiden's Flight 666. But one I want to briefly talk about is a favorite of mine, and that is Rush Beyond the Lighted Stage, a very by-the-numbers rock doc of a favorite band of mine that I want to talk about briefly to illustrate a point about documentaries in general. There is a spectrum of fans that watch this documentary. On one side, you have fans who probably know everything there is to know about the band, and that this documentary is going to be telling them little to no new facts. They own every album, they've seen every show, read every book, article, blog post they can find about this band. And there's very little that this documentary can offer them. On the far other side is fans that know little to nothing about this band. And this documentary will probably be watched by people more on the side of people who already know things about the band. However, they want to offer something to everyone, regardless of how much they knew coming into this experience. And this brings me back to Won't You Be My Neighbor. While I don't doubt that there are many die-hard Fred Rogers fans out there, I would say that for most people watching this film, their fandom was probably more in the middle. They knew who Fred Rogers was and what he was about, but maybe didn't know every single aspect of his life, or at least not yet. In this sense, I believe that Won't You Be My Neighbor shines in showing aspects of Mr. Rogers' life that would appeal to almost everyone in the audience, regardless of how much knowledge they had on the subject matter coming into the theater. It offers insights and interviews for the most dedicated Fred heads out there that they may not have seen, but that also gives chronological highlights to some of the more important steps in his career that most or people unfamiliar with Mr. Rogers may not have known. Won't You Be My Neighbor caters beautifully to both sides that have something to offer for everyone when it comes to Fred Rogers. While a documentary is different from a typical narrative-focused movie, it still needs to have some sort of plot or coherent story that ties it all together. And when you think about it, it seems kind of odd, right? Because when you're watching a documentary, it doesn't feel like a story because of what comprises a documentary. Usually a lot of interviews from various people, with the occasional narration and some clips of the subject matter interwoven between them. These don't seem like the type of ingredients that form a compelling narrative in a traditional sense. However, if combined just right, these standard documentary techniques can become greater than the sum of their parts, and form something that every documentary needs to be able to be truly great. A compelling story. Just like any movie, the audience needs to see some sort of narrative structure in order to be invested in your documentary. They need to meet the characters and see them struggle and grow, only to reach their potential and make a difference that they set out to achieve at the beginning of their journey. That's how it goes for most documentaries. We meet our hero, who is usually someone that the audience can relate to in some form or another, and we, the audience, see them dream of something big and powerful that the viewer knows that they will achieve, even if their character, at this time, can only dare to dream of accomplishing such a feat. That is a key thing that documentaries have that a lot of traditional narratives most likely don't. An audience that can know the ending of the movie before they've bought their ticket for it, and yet still enjoy it. This kind of goes along with my first big point in the fact that if you're creating a documentary about a person or event, or a group of people, there's a very high likelihood that people in the audience will be familiar with your subject of your documentary and already know a lot of key points that your film will touch on, and that is totally okay. Whether or not someone knows a lot of the content that will be shown doesn't stop them from enjoying the journey to and from these key points, just as much as a moviegoer that has no idea about the real-life occurrences that are going to be displayed in the documentary. In this respect, I see these people like the people that are going to see the big screen adaptation of their favorite book. They already know the big story points that they would assume that the movie will touch on, but they're interested to see what is included, what key parts are focused on, and most especially, how do the filmmakers get their narrative to arrive naturally at these moments that some in the audience know will be coming. Won't You Be My Neighbor goes about making this in a very common way for documentaries, going chronologically. Now, this certainly isn't a knock against the film, just because it follows the general formula that a lot of documentaries of its kind tend to follow. In fact, it's a testament to how effectively Won't You Be My Neighbor utilizes these techniques in the structure of a biopic documentary that it manages to stand out from similarly structured documentaries. It uses key moments from Mr. Rogers' life as a guide, and fills in the in-between with insightful interviews, narration, and even the occasional animation to create a very compelling story. For me personally, and I'm sure for a lot of other people, Fred Rogers is a childhood hero, and for sure a first ballot member of what people have called the Mount Rushmore of TV wholesomeness, alongside the likes of Bob Ross, Jim Henson, and Steve Irwin. And I believe that Won't You Be My Neighbor does him justice, through its narrative structure and wide-ranging appeal, to create a film based on the values to which he stood for, kindness and optimism. Let me know if you agree.
Won't you please, please won't you be my neighbor?